if you're new to these live streams, I'm first of all just going to clarify the reason why we're doing these around the coach certification training. This is a training where coaches get certified in advanced coaching disciplines within a very short period of time, usually somewhere between a few days and a few weeks. And the reason why we do these live streams is to go much deeper, to get into many different facets of the approaches and the disciplines that are covered in the training, because we just don't have time, even in the in the several hours of training that where we'll push into each specific discipline. We really just have enough time to cover the theory behind or the model behind the discipline, answer questions, for me to do a bit of a demonstration, and that's about it. And that takes a good bit of time on its own. So we're doing these live streams for the purpose of really covering additional facets of the of each discipline. And in fact, today is kind of apropos because we literally have titled today's live stream 5 facets of transformational coaching. And we're in week 4. Today's, I think, day 3 of week 4. And we're covering in week 4 strategy, the strategy discipline of coaching. And part of strategy is all the external facets of life and working with somebody on what they say and what they do and when they do it and how much of it they're doing. These are very basic strategic elements that, really the world is teaching us. I mean, we grow up with these basic understandings of external strategies, doing the math, understanding the English, and on and on and on. But the part of strategy that is left by our Western education, for the most part, even Western advice and support and mentoring for that matter, is the internal strategies. And internal strategies really cause true transformation for your client in their finances or in their career or in their business or in their relationships or in their body or in their health or in their longevity or in their energy level, in the way they manage their time. It truly transforms things because, I can give you some technique and provoke you to go ahead and try that technique, and that could totally make a difference in one narrow area. But when somebody changes inside, when your client actually shifts how they show up, how they feel, how they think, right? Those elements, that changes everything. Even I mean, it definitely changes the area that they're focused on, that they wanted the support in the first place, but it also transforms how they show up in almost any area a lot of the times, especially if you're doing it at the deepest level. And the reason I say that is because wherever they go, that inside goes along with them. You change them on the inside, the inside always has to show up somewhere on the outside, to some extent at least. I'm sure there's limitations to that. So that's what we're working with really in week 4. And I'm going to give you some real specifics today, some different facets, 5 specifically, facets of transformational coaching. And you want to use these 5 parts of your client's life. We're literally going to map out 5 different aspects of your client's life and how to actually transform different aspects or different ways to transform each of those 5 different aspects so that it truly transforms your client from the inside out. I actually learned these particular aspects and these particular steps originally from my original coaching mentor, Anthony Robbins. I remember that before I was directly trained as a coach by him, because I was going to work for him at the time, I understood I actually understood maybe a few of these facets at a maybe kind of a surface level, and I was more of a kind of an NLP wannabe, and I could, tweak and twist some different aspects of somebody's mindset to some extent, but I was only partially effective. And then after I went through training with Tony and he gave me these steps, and what was interesting was first time I saw Tony doing what he was doing, I remember walking into this seminar for the first time with myself and my family, and we don't know what to expect. We're just running in, and we're like late. I think we got in there in the first hour of training, and we saw somebody speaking at the front of the room, and some people were running around and doing different things, and like none of it registered for me, and we just kind of ended up kind of sitting down and trying to soak it all in, right? And and I remember by the time I was done with that weekend that I spent with Tony and his team, like I couldn't think the same way. Like I was a different person in that I saw things possible that didn't seem possible for me before. I was taking actions I never would have taken before. I was just like operating as if the world was a different place. Now, was the world a different place? No. No, it was the same world I walked into that seminar with, right? But I was operating differently because the inside had changed in me, right? So I met my life, my relationships, which were really, challenging at the time, and my career, which was really non-existent at the time. And I met those areas with a different level of optimism and possibility and technique and willingness to take action in different ways, motivation, all this different stuff. And in a very short period of time, those areas of my life radically improved. Not all of them and not totally, but I think that was really a result of how I ended up showing up to those different areas. I don't want to get into the details of that at this point, but it was a real eureka for me to have gone through some transformational work and come out the other end truly transformed, truly, as it says here, transformed. And I really wanted to be able to share that with others. I wanted to pass that on. I wanted to pay that forward. I was really motivated to do that. So years later, when I got the chance to go to work for Tony and actually coach for him, and I went through the training, I suddenly started to learn the steps that he had taken me through years before, me and a couple thousand other people, frankly. So after learning those steps and then starting to use those with clients that Tony had given me, I started to see, hey, this is some serious stuff. And I suddenly realized this is what had happened to me years earlier. And I was totally more effective than I ever was prior to having learned those approaches. So when you're intending to transform, your client's inside, the inner game, turn them from the caterpillar to the butterfly, as the graphic here shows, including any major life transformation. Because look, any major life transformation, there's going to have to be some inner game that's going to change. They're going to have to transform from the inside out in some ways. And there are 5 different facets of this that you want to center your work around, and 5 different techniques, really, frankly, more like 20 or 30 different techniques that you want to employ so that you can address those 5 different areas that are really manifesting the way that your client's really truly at the root of why your client is the way they are, why they think the way they think, why they act the way they act, how their life shows up. And if you succeed with even a few of these 5 different areas, even a few of these 20 or 30 different techniques, you'll transform your client. If you nail all 5, you change your client's life forever. I just demonstrated this the other day during week 4, and the client that I worked with, his life has changed forever. Chances are. Now it may not look like that today, because there's obviously some dominoes that are going to fall, but the decisions that he made and the emotions that he has cultivated now. And I'm guessing the actions he's already probably taken, have set a domino effect in motion that, and I see this again and again with clients I work with. Years later, they come back and they say, that day that we had that one conversation, it changed my life. I'm a whole different person. I have a whole different life. I have a whole different relationship. I have a whole different career. Like everything is different now as a result of that one stupid conversation that we have. I mean, they don't say that. I'm just saying that for a little bit of impact there. So, and I doubt that any of the clients I've had these types of conversations with recently will be any different as a result. I mean, they're really forever changed. I don't hesitate at all on that because I know what kind of impact this has had after 20 years of doing this kind of work. So I'll give you a metaphor for this, and then we'll kind of dance around that a little bit to give you these areas, and then we'll talk technique. So think about a cake. So I've drawn you my best rendition of a cake here. And if you want to bake a cake, you're going to need different things. You're going to need some ingredients, of course, right? And you need more than one ingredient. If you just take flour and throw it in the oven, you're not going to get a cake. Don't try that at home. So you bake cakes with frankly about 5 different things: flour, sugar, butter, and eggs, and then some other minor things, like baking soda, few little kind of very trace ingredients, right? But the big ingredients are these 4: flour, sugar, butter, and eggs, and then so it's just like the fat, the sugar, and the carbs basically. And then some leavening agents and some minor things, right? So let's think of that as like the 5th ingredient, some trace elements here, right? But it's basically 5 things that bakes a cake. And so think of your client like this. Your client has 5 different things, 5 different areas or facets of their life that creates the cake that they've currently manifested. That has it's kind of these things are. It's a great way of putting it. I didn't even think about this when I came up with the metaphor. It's baked in, right? It's baked into their life, these 5 different aspects. And what's great is that even though your client's life or their career or whatever they want to change might not look very nice at this point, these are the things that actually lead to that being that way. And since these are things that we can actually manipulate, these are things that we have some level of influence, if not control over, we can bake a new cake for that client. We can bake a new client, so to speak. We can rebake this thing. So let's get into what these 5 items are, and then we'll get into the techniques of it. And by the way, if you're in certification, then I gave you during week 4 this little mini workbook here, these what we call life change blueprints, okay? And I'm going to go over this with you today because we didn't have time in the training session. So, I went over the basics, like where we covered the 3 of life here. And of course, these 5 aspects are covered at the bottom in the roots because these elements are at the root of the cake, right? They're the ingredients, so to speak. But we're going to get into the rest of this where we actually go into the different techniques that I talk about inside the workbook. So pull out your workbook for this or check it out later. I'll make sure that this particular live stream I post in the members area so that I can give you this download right along with it, and you can kind of see them together as well. But anyway, we'll get to that in a few minutes. But let's cover these 5 areas first. So the first area, and this was kind of like the obvious one when you're working with a client, would be desires. So think this is area number 1, it's desires. So your client is a client because they have desires. Now, they might desire something good, or they might desire to remove or avoid or try to transform or change something bad. It's 6 1/2 dozen, okay? So everyone has desires, even if they call them frustrations or things they're angry about or things they hate, things they don't like. It's just desires, okay? So this is a domain of your client's life, and depending on their desires, and depending on how they are able or not able to meet those desires, it bakes something into their career and their life and their relationships and all of that. Their desires are going to impact that. Does that make sense? It's pretty basic. Second area, and I'm not really going clockwise or anything like that. It's just kind of desire. Think of desires as like they want to move up, right? So put it above there because they want to move towards those desires. It's like the North Star for them. But underneath all of that, another thing that's baked into your client's life would be motivations. So that's second. Second facet of transformation, second facet of your client's life that we want to understand and appreciate are their motivations. So now you might say, well, wait a second, Jeff, aren't their desires their motivations? Isn't that the same thing? And you would think that, wouldn't you? I mean, wouldn't you think like, okay, well, desires and motivations, same thing. Like they want their desires, their motivations are things that they want. So same. But that is just not the case. And the reason I say that is because if your client's motivations were the same as whatever their desires were, they would have their desires, or they probably wouldn't be in a session with you try to work out why they're stalled or stuck or not getting that desire met. Does that make sense? Or their desire is set up in such a way, even though their motivations might be the same as their desires, where it doesn't fit with these other patterns. So we'll get to that in a second. But most of the time, motivations and desires are two different things, because desires is like, this is what I came to the session with. This is what I say I want. And the motivations are all the underlying things. That's why I put it below the cake here. It's kind of a core thing. These are the underlying kind of motives and needs and things that are kind of pulling your client in different directions. Do you and I have 100% aligned motivations that all, out of the thousands of different emotions and things that we want and fears and values and needs that we have, do they all like come together and just push us in one singular focal point direction, in the direction of only what we desire in our life? Yes or no? I mean, come on. Like, that is not a hard one to work out. Our motivations are going like, here and there and there and there. Like, we got no motivations all over the map. All right? Everybody does. Now, can you get these, more in alignment? Can you maybe eliminate a couple of these that are going backwards, and maybe you've got an added one there? Oh, yeah. I mean, that's kind of the idea here. But the motivations are all over the place. We have conflicting motivations. We have needs that we must meet, but then we also have values that are, kind of high-minded ideals that we would like to pursue as well, right? And then we have, pains that we want to avoid, not just the things that we desired, but literally things that are just kind of like we don't even think about consciously, but they're down there somewhere and are, again, down here. These are unconscious motivations underneath the surface of the sea. Some of them are conscious. They'll share those with you. And then some of them are unconscious in their motivations. So we want to know what those are. That's the second domain. Third domain, if I can get this right, would be options. Options. So, and this is why I was saying sometimes desires are conflicting with motivations. In fact, most of the time, but even the exceptional cases when they're fully 100%, 1,000,000% aligned, doesn't happen. But let's just say it did, right? That all motivations, point to the desires. Then the reason why your client hasn't achieved these desires yet, other than just natural lag time, which should be alignment with their desires anyway, if they're 100% aligned, and if they're not, they can't be if patience is not one of their motivations, well, then their motivations are not aligned with their desires. So even that doesn't really fit this. But let's say, again, everything's perfect. The reason why they haven't achieved their desires is because they don't have the options available to them to achieve them. You need certain options to create the desires, not just motivations. So if somebody says, well, I want to make $1 million, and I said, well, why haven't you made $1 million? And they're 100% motivated. Everything is about making $1 million. It never happens, but let's just say it did. Why haven't you made that yet? Well, because, I'm homeless. And, you can't get a job when you're homeless. I mean, I can't even get a good shower, right? Or, well, because my job currently, I work at McDonald's, I make $12 an hour, and I don't have any time to work on my investments and all this other stuff, right? So you get that, that's all about options. It's like they don't seem to have the option available to them to make the decision that they may even know they need to make, right? So third domain, third facet of transformation that you need to be aware of in your coaching would be the options. What are the options that they've got, right? So, hey, what do you want? You know, where are you in terms of your motivations? You know, where, like, are you 100% committed to this or like 0%? And usually it's closer to 0 for most people if they bring a desire to their coach. And then finally, what are the options available, right? And by the way, even if everything's perfect, you're working with Michael Jordan as a client, he probably could use even more options. So options might not be like problematic, like I just described. I just shared the homeless option for, you know, like for, you know, to make it like an extreme so this can be more easily illustrated. But even Michael Jordan needs more options on how to make a basket or how to get it, how to play a good defense. You know, like it's still, there's still ways that as a coach you can up level the options. Because by the way, are there not desires for a lot of your clients, especially if they're really successful clients, that they're not just desires around like, they're not just desires for one specific little box goal. They're desires for never-ending progress to achieve more and more and more and more. They're the hungriest for, like, they'll never be satisfied. They'll never satiate certain desires that they have. Even if their motivations are aligned, they could always use better and more options or improvement of these options to accelerate on the trajectory that their life is taking them or their desires seem to be pushing them. So that's third facet of transformation is options. Fourth facet would be their patterns. And so this is huge because whatever patterns they're currently experiencing in their life, assuming their desires are ones that can be achieved, whatever these patterns are, there's going to be 1 or 2 or 3 or 20 of them that prevent them from achieving their desires. So patterns should bring you toward your desires, but most of the time they're preventing patterns. They actually take people down. They take people away from their desires. One of those patterns could be motivations, but more often there's other patterns that will just show up that actually eliminate options or hinder their progress towards their desires. So we want to know what those patterns are. We need to be able to alter and condition those patterns. And we'll get into that in a second. Finally, fifth facet of transformational coaching would be peer group. Because whatever your peer group is, that'll massively impact your life for almost anybody on earth, because life is a team sport. So, yeah, so the bottom line is, somebody has perfect motivations for the desires. Their patterns are amazing. They've got all the options of the world, at least inside they do. And then their peer group, you know, is totally against them achieving what they're after, not in any alignment, doesn't believe in them or what their desire is at all, and, you know, gives them massive pain every day for going after their desires. You know, how well is that going to go, right? Or there could be conflicts in the peer group. There could all sorts of other things in the peer group. Sometimes the desire has to do with peer group, and so these are more intimately connected. But sometimes the peer group just hinders options, so it can be, you know, somehow impacted between several of these. It could even impact patterns and motivations. Does that make sense? I mean, have you ever been in a situation where you really want something, but because your peer group doesn't want you to want it, that it makes you want it less, or it makes you have a motivation to stop wanting it? Or am I the only one that's ever experienced this in life? Yeah, most humans have experienced that. So these are the 5 aspects, or the 5 facets of transformational coaching. What you need to look at and consider in your client if you're going to transform them. And these are the areas also to transform: their desires, their motivations, their options, their patterns, and their peer group. So let's now get into the techniques, if you will, that we want to utilize in order to really appreciate and understand all of this. So the first one would be diagnosis. So to understand their desires, we need to diagnose. I'm sure I put this down wrong, but diagnose, you get the idea. You got to diagnose what their desires are, and you got to also diagnose the patterns or the motivations or whatever that prevent them from getting what they're after, what their desires are, because there's something getting in their way. So we got to diagnose that stuff. So as it says in your sheet or your workbook, ask what they want. Hey, what do you want? Ask, hey, what's preventing you from getting that? This is very straightforward, right? And you're going to discover their desires, and then what other aspects, what other facets of the transformational aspects of their life, what other facets of the ingredients or the roots of their life are actually impacting or preventing them from getting that desire. So we want to use different techniques like meta model, where you ask, hey, how specifically is that preventing you? Or what specifically is getting in your way? Or look at what the specifics of the patterns are so you can get really precise as to what the preventing patterns might be. I'm not going to give you all of meta model here. You can look that up, or you can cover it in some of our other trainings that we provide that, like Quick Start discusses that in a decent amount of detail. You can also discover what are the emotions. These are not just motivations, but like, different emotions and mindsets that might get in the way there. A lot of times your client's not conscious of this, but you want to discover what those are. You want to discover what the need structures are. Those are in the motivations category. Like, what are the survival needs that are pushing and pulling them away from or not 100% aligned with moving in the direction of their desires? What about beliefs? Beliefs will orchestrate all of this different stuff. It'll orchestrate the mindset. So you want to ask questions like, why? Why is that preventing you? What's going on with you? What about you is preventing you or stopping you from achieving that desire? What's not possible here? That's going to cover options as well, but those are beliefs. What they believe the options are. If I don't believe in an option, then that option's not available to me. Even if that option really is available to me. You don't necessarily need more resources. You need more resourcefulness, and that's a mindset thing. That's a belief thing. You want to look at global beliefs, things like, what about people? What about what's possible for me? What about money? What about relationships? What about women? What about men? These are overgeneralizations that you can start to really kind of chip away at with the meta model by discovering what's specifically about men, what's specifically about money. Is that always the way it is with men? Is that always the way it is with money? Again, look up and research meta model. If you want to get the full list of those questions. We also cover it in Quick Start. So those are just some of the techniques. I mean, there's like 4 or 5 techniques right there, just covering the diagnosis process. Let's get into the second facet, motivations. And in motivation, I'm going to get down low for this one. We need to, in order to not discover what the motivations are, because we've already covered that with desires, but in order to change the motivations, we want to get what's called, is this on the screen? Okay, I hope it is. We want to get leverage. If there's not enough leverage, if there's not enough of a lever around the motivations, then you're shot. Those motivations, no matter how many resources are available to your client, those motivations are going to pull them away. They're going to be split. They're not going to be fully aligned with that journey to their desires, right? So as it says here, you want to have your client link massive, unbearable, consistent pain to not making the changes required to meet their desires, and massive, consistent, long-lasting pleasure to actually making the changes they need to make. How's that for straight talk? So ask things like, what will you lose if you don't change? How will that feel? What will you gain if you do change, or when you do change? How will that feel? Who will you become if you don't or do change? How will that feel? So you get how these questions have bearing on everything that we've already discussed, like their whole life, their options, who they become, what their beliefs are. This makes an impact here, right? So those are just some of many questions that you would utilize in order to access a certain amount of leverage or get a lever on your client's motivations. That metaphor, I think, that lever metaphor is really critical, because their motivations will seem like a rock that, oh, well, you want this way, this is your needs, this is the way what you value, then, well, that's why their life is the way it is, because of all that stuff. You've got to lever that. You've got to pry it open a bit. And so you're using this process of powerful questions and motivating discussions and finding out their pain and pleasure points to see not only where there a lack of alignment, but also where is there enough leverage to get them to actually want to make the change. There's always a seed of leverage in every single client. You just got to find it. You got to find where that leverage is, where the true deepest motivations are of pain or pleasure that will cause them to transform. So the biggest leverage would be the 4 survival needs. I'm not going to get into those today. Look them up. We've talked about those during training. If they will lose too many needs, when they change, they'll never change. If they lose needs by not changing and they can actually believe that and see that, they're going to change instantaneously, and their motivations are not going to be something that holds them back anymore. In fact, they'll be demanding for options and new patterns so that they can meet these desires. They'll be begging for it. That's what you're kind of looking for there. So you want to find also ways that they know they'll meet more of their needs at higher levels if they actually make the change that's required. And again, if you bake that into their cake, they're going to find options. They'll figure it out for themselves, although you could, of course, support them in that. That's a whole different level than motivations that are all over the map, right? So let's see. And then finally, there's a process that's called core transformation. We do this during the actual live on-site trainings. We also cover this in Master Coach University in the Mastery Program inside of Effortless Enrollment, Module 1, Emotional Mastery. And that is, core transformation is really a study of consequences. Motivations are always connected, though. Why are we motivated, right? Even if we're lazy, we're motivated to be lazy, right? Like, why does somebody have certain motivations to do things differently than somebody else? The reason why those motivations are set up in the first place is because of consequences. Your brain wants the best for you, and it wants to help you to avoid the worst things, right? So in order to do that, it creates a kind of a motor, right? And by the way, the motor neurons in your brain get you to move, right? That's why we call it motivation. You know, if the motivation in the motor neurons says lion is chasing me, you will get adrenaline and you will move real fast, right? It's just boom. It's automatic, right? There's very little consciousness around that. You just go. So motivation, I'm trying to cue in on this here. Motivation is an unconscious process that is hardwired into your nervous system only for one purpose, which is to recognize and act on, and I write this down, it's so critical, consequence. That's what all this is about. That's it. If there were no consequences in life, we would have no need for motivations. That's it. So people have their motivations juxtaposed with their perception of consequence. Your job is to shift that perception by asking, what are the consequences if you don't make the change? What are the worst consequences? What are the consequences they've been ignoring or not noticing? The reason why somebody like who smokes doesn't quit is not because they don't know that they're going to die. They're not facing and motivated by those consequences because they're not associating with them deeply. Your job is to get your client deeply associated to the consequences that they have not recognized that would cause those motivations to transform, that would get these aligned with their desires, if at all possible. That's the motivation piece. And so that's what we call leverage. We're leveraging our client through consequence, and that transforms motivation. Make sense? Questions? This is a big deal and is the primary reason why coaches are ineffective, not because they don't have a lot of options and they don't have cool patterns that they can run with their clients and they don't have some neat answers or something, is because they miss the motivation piece and they blame their client for it as if they have no impact on their client's motivation. And frankly, they probably don't, but it's not because they couldn't, it's because they're not looking at consequences and they're not getting leverage. They don't have skill sets here, or they're not applying it because maybe frankly, the coach needs motivational help, right? It's like the coach is not motivated enough to actually have the conversation that they maybe are uncomfortable with having. Maybe it's a hard conversation to have. It usually is, but that's what you're paid for. You don't like that. You don't feel good about it. It's not just like a real positive, let's just flim flam, airy fairy, just woo woo our clients to death. This isn't that, and you don't want to do it. Well, then you're the problem, not your client. Don't blame your client for your motivational issue. You just want to talk to people that are fun to talk to. You don't really want to add any value in the areas that'll truly transform their life, really. And you're just not willing to go through the emotional labor of that conversation for whatever reason. And so we got to work on you first and your motivations there. So you're willing to have a tough conversation, a lot of times at least, a tough conversation with your client. So them's the motivations and the leverage process. Let's move on to step 3 here, which is looking at these options. And to transform your client's options, we need alternatives. And what I like to call these empowering alternatives. Okay, so we don't want just any option. We want an empowering option, as you might imagine. So the intention of this portion, the transform options, is provide strategies to cause the easiest, quickest, or most empowering or fulfilling change. So we don't want just a change that's going to get them their desire. We want a change that's going to be fulfilling for them, empowering for them across many aspects of their life. So there's lots of different techniques. We have one called identity theft, which is to look at people who have actually accomplished the desire and step into their experience and feel what they feel and see what they see and look at the world through different perspectives. Those perspectives might be valuable. Look at the way that the different options may or may not mesh with motivations, mesh with survival needs. To work with what are the particular emotions that are currently dominating how they go towards their desires, and what might be better options for those emotions, because emotions are part of the options. We're not just one emotion. We have infinite, basically, emotions that we could select, mindsets that we could select on our journey to meet our desires. I mean, that's pretty exciting. And then finally, any other resource, external resources for that matter, that may be important to bake in to the process that gets the client towards their desires. So things that you might ask, frankly, I wouldn't look at these as scripting items. I would look at these as almost things to, questions to come from, spaces to stand as you're kind of working out what the options are. What has to happen for you to get what you want? What has to happen for you to meet your needs? What actions could you take to make this change? And don't just think of this from an action perspective. I have a coach I'm working with right now, and all she ever asks is, what should you do? What can we do? What can we do? What can we do? And that's fine. That's looking at options for, obviously, an obvious one, behavior. But what about options for mindset or emotion? So what could you feel? What could you think? What could you believe? Right? That's different. You know, what about options? What about options for different desires or focuses? What could you focus on differently, right? There's probably, 10 or 20 of these different kind of levels of options that you could consider for your client. Don't just think of options as a single facet or one-dimensional perspective. Think of all the different dimensions of options your client can consider, and then which dimensions might be most important to actually make some changes with or consider different options around. Because you're going to notice some really disempowering, like behavior or mindset or desires or something going on here that they're going to need some empowering alternatives around. So look for those elements. All right, so we covered empowering alternatives, transforming options. Let's get into step 4, which is, again, impacting this fourth area, this fourth facet of what transformed your client, which is, again, we call them patterns here. So patterns that once you know the empowering alternative, really, you're just looking for the right pattern to condition. So conditioning is about getting the client so fit, so conditioned for the pattern that's going to really actually have them achieve what they want, that they're gonna get what they're after. As it says here in the intention in your workbook, to program the client with the resources needed to initiate a lasting change. Program them. I think of this as almost like, coding in a computer. We just get the right pattern, the right code for your client, and everything just works out. I mean, all of this is a pattern, but we just want to condition whatever new patterns need to stick, because the empowering alternative will tell you what that is, but the conditioning makes it so, because this is just knowledge. Just knowing the empowering alternative is not enough. You've got to turn that knowledge into real transformation by conditioning the pattern, and then they get their desire met. That's really what will truly set your client free. A lot of times that's needed. It's not just going to be an automatic thing. So provide, what did it say here? Program the client with the resources needed. So they find the resources in the third step, and you reprogram them with whatever those resources are. All sorts of different ways to do that. You could use success rituals, as we learned in this training, different things you could do with your mind and body to condition new patterns for yourself, to actually get you to act in a certain way, or behave, or think in a certain way, or feel in a certain way. There is ways to interrupt patterns. So there might be disempowering patterns that are hurting their journey towards these desires that need to be interrupted. So you let them run their pattern, and then you massively shake it up. All sorts of different techniques for that. Have them visualize different things to interrupt that pattern. You can kind of get in their face about things and do something outrageous, and that'll interrupt and annihilate that pattern. You don't want to let them go back to that pattern. You run the pattern again and see how they operate. Once you've interrupted it 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 times, they can never go back to the old limiting pattern. All of a sudden, what was preventing them from getting what they wanted before, it's not even baked in anymore. You've already messed it up. And now you condition in whatever the new option is that you figured out. And that could be rehearsed. You could think about it into the future, so to speak. There could be reward and punishment systems, which are really more devised in motivations, but you can set them in and condition that new motivation if that's the consequence patterns are the ones that need to be set the most. There's also a hypnotic patterning that you can utilize, stories, using the 5 senses, emotion. These are all patterning elements that will condition a client quite effectively. Again, the identity theft technique, taking on somebody else's identity and imagining yourself as that person. Bam, new pattern right there. And that new pattern can actually start happening again and again and again and again. If you do it, you could literally do that in the session. You don't have to wait between sessions for them to actually accomplish those transformations. Let's see, core transformation process, again, usually more impacting on motivations, but again, that's a repatterning and a conditioning technique, and on and on and on. I won't go into or belabor more aspects of this. Final 5th area here that we were talking about before, peer group that impacts and is kind of baked into your client's life. The process here is literally to actually transform what's going on in the peer group. So the intention in the peer group and environment step is to, as it says in your workbook, create an environment and community, i.e. a peer group, that ensures lasting change. So usually the peer group is not set up for this client to really massively change and meet their desires and be empowered and really help themselves and others. So you want to be asking them questions like is written in this workbook. Who can keep you accountable for this change? Maybe there's people that really will support them. Maybe not, but you might at least look for that. Who is in your life or could be in your life that already gets those kind of results? So maybe there's somebody that's a great role model for them that they can tap into. Now, that's just a very surface level rendition of what can be done in peer group. But you could also have them make commitments to and share the change, the new pattern, the new options that they've come up with people around them. You know, people around them might be really inspired by the change that they share. That's not always guaranteed. You want to do this strategically, but that is possible depending on the peer group. Besides that, you'll see this in number 3 in your workbook, personal 360s. These are ways to tap into what the peer group sees that they don't see, so they kind of have an awareness of other patterns that maybe didn't even come up in the session. You could do kind of a mini 360 or SWOT analysis with people in your peer group, like, hey, what are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? What do you need to tell me? What do I need to know about me? You know, so very simple stuff. Sometimes can be quite enlightening for a client. Cleaning up problems with peer group, making apologies where needed, making requests. Sometimes there's people in the peer group that you need to make a request for. You need to tap into the possibilities that could emerge from that relationship by requesting. So a lot of times peer group has some real preventing factors that are disempowering, which is why you might need to clean up a bit of a mess in a relationship or apologize for something that your client might have been perpetrating. And you can get them to actually make that apology. That takes some real courage. It's tough to do, but that's an aspect of peer group. And then again, like I said, asking and requesting. The peer group is where all the options and the resources are really found a lot of times. Obviously, there's inner resources, but the external resources, a lot of times you can tap into those with a peer group. Strategic coach, trying to remember, Dan Sullivan, in fact, I think he wrote an ebook on this. I haven't checked it out yet, but it's called Who, Not How. When somebody's trying to figure out the strategy, figuring out the how, not the internal how, but like, okay, what am I going to do outside? A lot of times the answer to that question is not how, it's who. So tap into the peer group that already has that strategy, that already can provide that know-how, that mentorship, that resource. And all of a sudden, boom, you've got the how. The how is encapsulated in the team, encapsulated in the community around your client. Very powerful stuff right there. And then finally, any people that they need to attract into their life, that they need to connect deeply with, or enough such that they can tap into new resources as well. So maybe setting a goal or a new desire for different people around them as well. So that constitutes the peer group transformational process, if you will. And again, I've only been able to, during this time that we had together, go over these in kind of a surface level, but I'm covering a lot of different techniques. These are all documented in your workbook, and we've spoken to them at least in limited quantities here. For more learning on this, to go to a next level, you really got to spend really 12 weeks with us in strategy immersion training, where we go deep on each of these different steps, each of these different facets, and we cover on and on and on training over several months period on each of these elements, and then you actually practice it and do it during the training session and get feedback. But that's another conversation. So we've gone, let's see, did we do everything we're supposed to do here? Yeah, we covered the 5 items. We covered the blueprint worksheet. Again, I'm going to put this in the members area so you have access to the worksheet. So all this will be covered in writing in there, and then you can watch this again if you need to. Okay, that was a lot. We're really close to our last live stream. We're going to do one more of these, maybe 2, but at least one, the next day or 2. So look for that. And before we complete today, I really want to just acknowledge you for spending this time with myself and my team and the other students in certification, for really, putting yourself out there to the point of learning and onboarding some really critical disciplines of coaching, some of the most advanced things that you can learn and use as a coach that you'll ever learn. And no matter where you are as a coach, that journey is a journey that's worth taking. I really want to acknowledge you for having been on this journey with me and with, again, your fellow students and your clients that you've working with for the last days or months or however long it's been. Regardless of the time that we've put into this, and I know and I really acknowledge that you've done things that nobody will ever realize that you've done to prepare yourself for kind of a lifetime foundation of what it takes to transform life, to make a difference for people in whatever area you're going to impact them in, whatever niche you're working on. But I also just want to say that, the journey's not over. This is a beginning, not an end. The climb that you make as a coach to be a master is a mountain, and that mountain takes strength and resilience and persistence. But it's also a mountain that has no top. You're never done. Your cake is never baked. Okay? So we're always needing to transform ourselves. Always need to transform and look into and tap into our desires and motivations and options and the patterns that we are going through in our peer group as well. And if we're not hypocritical and we really are shining examples of what's possible as coaches, then we're going to walk our talk with this stuff too. Whether it's getting coaching on these things or just working on these things for ourselves or both, like you got to start with you. You know, we don't want to be hypocrites here. We want to be able to be shining examples of what's possible and then help our clients. Put the mask on you first as the plane's going down, then take care of everybody else around you. That's the order of this. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't get to take care of people along the way. You could take care of people today and yesterday and tomorrow as much as you want. But if you ignore you, you're going to limit what can go through you. You're going to have limitations around what you can transmit. You're going to limit the vessel for the transformation and what you're as the conduit for transformation for your clients. You're going to limit that vessel. You're going to limit that conduit. This is the temple of where all that transformation flows through. I'm not saying it flows from that. I mean, that depends on your spiritual beliefs probably, but I believe that, you know, what I can give my clients doesn't come from me. It's not like I make it up. It comes through me because it's something that's available to me in the ether, in the universe, from God or whatever you believe, you know. And I'm just the conduit. I'm just the vessel for all of that today. And someday when I pass, someone else will be. And someday when you meet whoever you're going to help that I'm not going to ever meet because you have access to them, because you've attracted them to you, you'll be the vessel for that. And that source of that transformation will come from wherever it comes from, whatever you believe. Like I said, it's not coming from you, but it definitely goes through you. That's just my belief. You got to decide what you believe. But we don't want to limit ourselves. We want to take care of ourselves because so then we can be the greatest transformational, like I said, conduit or vessel possible for our clients as well. That's the excuse to be a little selfish here as we care for others. Because as we care for ourselves, naturally other people are going to impact anyway. Even if we didn't care about them, we'd impact them because we'd be an example of what's possible. So let's go for it for ourselves. Let's be a little selfish. And I really acknowledge you for taking on the commitment, the profound privilege to transform lives around you. It's an amazing thing that we do. So we'll talk about that more as we get to the wrap up and we get into the commencement. But I didn't want to step out of this conversation as it dawned on me to share it as we're getting close to the completion point here. Finally, I'm going to give you some actions. We're not quite done with this conversation yet. I'm going to give you some actions to do based upon what we learned today. Action number 1, think of a client and what's going on with their desires, motivations, options, patterns, and peer group. Think about what's going on with my client's desires. What's going on with their motivations? And don't just give the quick lazy response. Like really think through it. What are all the motivations that you can think about? What have you asked them? What have you learned? What do you perceive? What could you kind of hallucinate? Like just use your imagination and intuition here. You won't have the perfect answer. This is not about being right about it. This is just about thinking through it. Give yourself a chance to dream a little bit about this and meditate on it. Options, patterns, peer group, all that. Think about what's going on there. That's assignment number 1. That's a whole separate assignment. Just think. Sit down for 5 minutes and think about it. Action 2. Choose one technique to use with that client in the next section, in the next session that you have with them. So think about using maybe more diagnostics or getting leverage with them or empowering alternatives or conditioning or peer group approaches. Just think about choose one technique, one approach to one of these domains, one of these approaches, one of these steps, if you will, that you're going to use in their next session, whatever that's going to be, and plan it out. That's, in fact, action number 3. Plan out what you're going to do. What are you going to do with that motivation technique? What are you going to do with that conditioning pattern? Right? What are you going to do? And then write it down, put it in writing. And finally, action number 4, of course, do it. It's the only way you're going to learn is by doing this stuff. So plan it out, work out, really strategize this. Decide which area you're going to focus on, just one. You can do all the rest another time, take it one at a time, make it easy on yourself, and then go plan it out and then do it. You can even bring your notes to that session and say, hey, I got some notes here. I want to take you through this thing that I came up with in between sessions. Your client will be grateful to you for the fact that you actually thought about them. You actually spent time preparing. They're really going to appreciate that. Doesn't mean that it's going to go perfect. Doesn't mean that that's exactly the thing to do. But man, does that make a difference just for your relationship with your client, if not the value that you'll add to them? This is the kind of thinking that it takes to be in a position where you really can masterfully do this. It doesn't mean you got to plan out every session from now on. It just means you want to think from this perspective, for the next months and years, to the point where you can't help but just kind of unconsciously come up with this stuff between sessions, whether or not you put conscious time into it or not. And then guess what? When you step into that session, it just comes through you then. And that's when it becomes effortless. When I show up for sessions, I get in the right state of mind, right? And I prepare for that way. But I don't have to go through all this rigmarole anymore because I've done it so much. It just kind of comes through me. I'm a conduit. I'm the vessel for that. But you got to kind of hammer yourself into being that vessel. So these are the actions to take. So that said, I'm going to just give you one last invitation here, which is I'm going to ask you to, wherever you're seeing this, to tap into the artificial intelligence algorithms that are available to us nowadays in these kind of ways that we capture content and experience things that we want. If this made a difference for you, or if it was valuable to you, then go ahead and hit the like button wherever you are, because I know two things will come from that. Number one is whatever that system is that gave you this information, the AI there will naturally send you more because they want you getting more of what you like and what you appreciate and what's valuable for you. So that's just going to help you as long as this made a difference for you in some way, and you want that. Second, it'll also find people that are similar to you, your brothers and sisters, your twins from across the world, that maybe they need this and they haven't even found it yet. They haven't thought to look, or I haven't attracted them into my domain yet or into my world. And that AI somehow, some way, knows a lot about you. Maybe it shouldn't, but usually they do nowadays. And it knows a lot about them. And they find, hey, these people are similar. I bet they want this. And that'll really help them. It'll give them a gift, and it'll also give me access to really helping somebody else that maybe I never would have. So it doesn't cost anything. I heard that it was free to hit the like buttons nowadays. So it's totally free for you to do it. But I know if you do it, it'll make a difference in ways that we can't even think about or imagine completely at this point, because this stuff is really complex nowadays, the way this happens. But I'm really grateful that we have this avenue through which we can connect. I just want to make sure we could tap into it as much as possible. So if you're willing to partner with me on that, I'm very grateful for it. And the best way to make sure that you get notifications when we have these conversations is by going over to YouTube. I'll put a link in the replay anywhere else that you might be seeing this, to the YouTube replay, and then subscribe and hit the little bell, because the bell actually makes sure that it will push to you the notification that I'm actually coming on. So you got control over knowing the next time I've got brand new tutorials or brand new live streams or brand new content or whatever it is that I'm coming up with next, because I'm not going to stop just because we're almost done with this particular stream or set of live streams that we're doing in certifications. So look forward to talking to you in our last couple live streams in the next couple days. And